course it does. It's kind of interesting, though, because it's very reminiscent of the meeting in January of 1941 between Molotov and Hitler in Berlin. Molotov requested the meeting and came in with Stalin's demands. Not Stalin's recommendations or requests, Stalin's demands. Stalin demands control of the Bosporus, control of the Dardanelles. Stalin demands control of these areas in Romania and Bulgaria that adjoin the Dardanelles. Stalin demands control of Finland, And Hitler sort of sat there and said, my God, these people are crazy. They're threatening the whole world. And it was a very unsatisfactory meeting. Now, subsequently, some smart people on the German general staff tried to make the point that let Stalin do what he likes. If he does that, he'll be at war with the British Empire and everyone else because they can't accept these things. And that would work to our advantage. But foolish Hitler said, no, we have to defend civilization, the West, against the Soviets. Imagine that. The rest is history. You got a war. The problem I have with this meeting that you're just describing is Zelensky and Netanyahu are joined at the hip. They're both supported by the same groups of people. Let's be frank. The same groups of people that want to essentially denude the populations of the Middle East of Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs and replace them with Jews are the same people that want to do something similar to Russia. So they are backing the Ukraine mess. And the bad news is that we don't seem to want to recognize that, and we're not willing to stand up to it because those same forces own everyone. Literally. How do you turn to people that have given you hundreds of millions of dollars, who have enriched you, who've helped you to win elections, who've kept you in power, kept you in office, even though their policies, many of them are really distasteful, both domestically as well as in foreign policy? I don't know. But I fear that this meeting is going to lead to a widening of the war. Just as the meeting in January of 41 led to catastrophe. I think these meetings in Washington did not solve any problems. It didn't take us off the path of disaster. It's keeping us on it. And all we have to do is look at the global energy complex and look at the global economy, and we know that all of those things are plunging into the abyss. People here in the United States, and I think in Europe, don't realize we haven't even begun to feel the effects of the disrupted energy complex. It's going to get a lot worse. I look at the situation in Germany. The VW is essentially committing Harry-Kari. It's on a suicidal path. I don't know how the German government can survive. This is a bad situation. And instead of leading us out of it, which is what Washington under Trump was supposed to do, we're marching right into it. So it's not so much that Trump is making any decisions. It's his failure to make the right decisions and extending these policies that will bring disaster to us and to Europe and to the Middle East.
Well, on that topic, though, the energy crisis, again, this is something that Trump brought up in his meeting with Netanyahu, but he also cited a concern about energy and global economy as the reason why he signed the MOU, which he then walked away from, well, pretty much as he signed it. But now, of course, the issue of Hormuz has not been solved. It's not going to be solved. It seems we can add the Red Sea on top of this just to make it even more complicated. And we see these Saudi energy facilities being struck. And, you can add a lot of other crises on top of there. But energy prices don't seem to reflect the dire realities that you speak of. Again, I'm not contesting what you're saying. I'm just trying to make sense of how to understand the energy price, because it doesn't really make much sense. We can watch on TV the energy fields in Saudi Arabia burning at the same time. The oil prices are dropping. I'm just wondering, how do you make sense of this?
Well, there's a yawning gap between reality and fantasy in Wall Street. Wall Street is accustomed to manipulation. Remember, everything is financialized for Wall Street. You don't have people in Wall Street who've ever been to drilling rigs. You don't have people on Wall Street who have visited any refineries. If you ask one of them, how many refineries do we have today? How many refineries did we have 30 years ago? They have no idea. They don't see a problem. And the White House, thanks to the leadership of Trump and his inner circle of advisors, has been very effective at manipulating oil prices. But we know, for instance, that the cost of oil coming off a ship right now is about $140 a barrel. But that's not the paper price. This is all going to change. In other words, what you have right now, what's the right word? We talk about latency in communications of the military. That, as a result of the structure of your communications, orders or information or intelligence take time to arrive at a location. It's not instantaneous. Well, that's what you're dealing with right now in the oil market. So if you listen to Jeff Curry or somebody like Pilkington and others who have years of experience in the oil industry, they're all saying the same thing. Yeah, you're right. The reality hasn't caught up yet, but it will. And when it catches up this time around, it's going to be awful. Weeks ago we said, well, if President Trump steps out of this or puts an end to it, there's a chance we could get out of this with minimal damage. 2 or 3 years, we could return to normalcy. But where we're headed right now, it'll be a decade or more. And everything is going to change. I mean, when you listen to the Iranians and others in the Middle East who are fundamentally opposed to us in Israel, they all say the same thing. Sykes-Picot is over. In other words, the structures of the past that were formulated at the end of the First World War are going away. We're going to live in a new Middle East, and it's not going to be one dominated. It's not going to be the Greater Israel Project. It's not going to be the United States. It's going to be indigenous. And the two great powers that are going to shape these things and decide these things are not the United States and Israel. They're primarily Iranians and Turks because they live there, but also Chinese and Russians, the Chinese especially, because they're the only country in the world that can help rebuild anything. We're broke. We're on the edge of a total financial meltdown. It's like a lot of things. You and I stand at the railroad crossing, and we look out and we say, see, look over there. The train is coming. The locomotive is coming. And everybody says, oh, yeah, you've been saying that for the last 6 hours. Hasn't gotten here yet. Yeah, but we can see it now. It's visible. It's coming. Yeah, right. Fine. Yeah, wake me when it arrives. Well, it's going to arrive, Glenn. So, you can replay this at some point in the future. And the people that all said, oh, I'm crazy, Curry's crazy, all these other experts are crazy, all these other military analysts are crazy, replay it. And everybody will reel in shock. Well, why didn't we do something? That will be the question. Well, the man who has to do something is named Donald Trump. And it's not a question of what he's doing. It's a question of what he's failing to do. He's just decided not to decide. And that's why you get this vacillation every other day. I'm going to destroy them. I'll hit every bridge. Okay. What difference does that make? What are you going to do? Destroy every hospital? What's your plan? What targets are going to be so important? Are you going to, we're going to seize Carg Island. Oh, that'll be good. Great. Yeah. What are all those soldiers on Carg Island going to do as they sit under constant bombardment from the Iranians? It'll be an exercise in suicide and certain death. Okay. Well, then we'll destroy Carg Island. Okay. Now what? There's no sense of, this whole thing makes no sense. And the intelligent thing to do is to stop it. There's not going to be a public surrender by us or by Iran. He's just going to have to disengage. And he will. He'll disengage. But not until the 11th hour and not until it's too late. And only when the economy here at home is awful and is really profoundly affecting everyone in Washington. That's coming. It's absolutely certainly coming. So I don't know what to tell you, except that President Trump does not fully appreciate the limits of American air and naval power. He never understood that our military power was always structured for relatively short campaigns against opponents like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Africa, people without air and missile defenses, let alone operational strike capabilities in the form of ballistic missiles. So, in addition, we have to operate at a very long logistical support system, and that's very fragile. And that's one of the reasons we're in a pause right now. So this is not a new problem. We've been dealing with this, contrary to popular belief, since the Bush administration in 2001. But that's where we are. And Trump has never understood it. And he's now going to pay a terrible price for it, I predict, politically.
On your analogy, though, of the approaching train, there's another predictable disaster which nobody appears to want to acknowledge, which is the pending Russian victory. That is, I see, despite all evidence, our political media establishment still holds on to the narrative that the tide is turning in Ukraine and NATO's favor. But we now see, key territory collapsing. We see this speech by Putin, in which he seems very confident. We hear from Moscow that they're quite angry and ready to take the gloves off. They have no trust more in diplomacy, which means that they will go for a very brutal victory instead. And I guess in this context, we now see General Surovikin, also known as General Armageddon, being reintroduced. I was wondering, what do you read into this?
Well, the last few days, we've had a speech by Putin to a very large audience inside the Kremlin, and another presentation with veterans, primarily naval officers, as I understand it, based on the uniforms. They were both important because President Putin signaled, that things are about to change. He pointed out that to this point, we have moved very methodically, deliberately, for various reasons. Obviously, this is probably the man in the history of Russia that has been most concerned about Russian lives of anyone I can think of over the last 1,000 years, which is a credit to him. But he pointed out that he said, I have had to be very cautious because of the economy. I wanted to preserve the structure of the economy, the standards of living, our prosperity. And we had to accept the fact that the build-up to the point where we are now with the kinds of forces that we have and capabilities would take time. He said, we've accomplished all those goals. We're doing very well. Frankly, all these sanctions that people in Washington love because they feel noble and moral for doing it are irrelevant and have had little to no impact on anybody. People have all learned how to circumvent these sanctions and get on with life, especially Russia. And he said, I've talked to veterans and they said, we need to be more bold. In other words, let's get on with this. Let's crush this enemy and be done with it. Then the next day he spoke, or I guess it may have been later on that day, he spoke with these veterans and he went further and he said, perhaps not this week or tomorrow, but sometime soon, these lands in Western Ukraine will probably end up being Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, again, Slovakian. A lot of people became very upset over that, and you had the Poles say, oh no, we want nothing to do with that. But in truth, he's going once again back to something that we in the United States ignore at our peril, and that is history and culture and language and people, identity. And I remember during the Kosovo Air Campaign, there was a question that came up about why both Serbs and Croats were so opposed to the rebuilding of a mosque in Banja Luka. And so I asked one of the German general staff officers, who incidentally is now a major general, he may be retired by now, very able man, and I said, help me out. I don't have time to research this myself, find out what the issue is. And he did, came back, wrote a very short paper, only a couple of pages long, handed it to me the next day, and sure enough, it turned out that the Banja Luka Mosque had been erected with the money that the population of Eastern Slavonia had collected to buy back the head of an Austrian nobleman who had commanded the defense of eastern Slavonia against the Turks. This was in the early 1600s. And the sad part was that this particular man had been commanding that area for years. Everybody in eastern Slavonia loved the man because he protected them from the Ottomans. And he unfortunately was killed in battle, and the Turks cut his head off and took it back, which they like to do, and sent it to the Sultan, and then said, if you want to bury this man, with his full body, you're going to have to buy the head. So they collected several, pounds of gold and bought it. That gold paid for the creation of the mosque in Banja Luka. And the answer I got back from the people above me, the Americans at the Supreme Headquarters of Light Powers Europe, says, well, this is ridiculous. That happened 300 or 400 years ago. Who cares about that? That doesn't mean anything. I said in the Balkans, that was yesterday. We don't understand Europeans. And so when President Putin made his comments, he was telling the truth. Most of what we call Ukraine was part of Polish Lithuania. In fact, before this, we were talking about Minsk. I have not been to Minsk, but there used to be a giant column that stood in Minsk, and it said in 3 languages, "Here begins Lithuania." Well, not anymore. But I'll guarantee if you go to Lithuania, the Lithuanians are well aware of that. And Polish Lithuania dominated Ukraine, is what we call Ukraine. And when he says that Ukraine was not a nation state, he's not wrong. It was more of a region. And it was usually fragmented or split between the East Bank, West Bank, or what they used to call right bank, left bank Cossacks. It's a very complex part of the world. But his point is, the people that are living on the terrain now today in many of these areas are not Ukrainians. And I know especially the Hungarians that are living there would very much like to rejoin Hungary and get out from underneath the Ukrainians. I'm sure some Poles feel the same way. I'm not advocating the systematic dismantlement of Ukraine, though I think at some point it's probably going to happen because it's happened before. And what we don't understand in the United States is this is how you create peace. This is how you create solutions. You make these decisions. We made a series of bad decisions at the end of World War II. We left too much of it to Stalin, and he created a monster. And by the way, Putin effectively said that. He created this construct called Ukraine. Why? Because it's false. It's not real. It's not historically accurate. And a friend of mine was just telling me, who came back recently from Europe, that I guess there was a demonstration put on somewhere by Ukrainians. They ran into one of the towns, I think it may be Konstantinovka. I don't speak the language, so I may have pronounced that wrong. And they put up some Ukrainian flags and took pictures. So they could send this to the media and say, well, the town really isn't in Russian hands. So the Russians showed up, they all stopped and surrendered. And the Russians said, what are you doing? He said, well, we were told to come over and do this. So we did it. He said, well, what do you want to do? He said, well, what we really want to do is surrender. And so they surrendered to the Russians, and they pointed out the Russians treated them very well, and they all said, look, we're all sick of this war. This needs to end. We need to stop killing each other. I think that sentiment is very strong, but it doesn't reach the White House. It doesn't reach Paris. It doesn't reach Berlin. It doesn't reach London. It needs to, but it doesn't. And the media are complicit with the governments, and the governments are in the hands of these globalists. And these are the same people driving the wars in both locations. And by the way, they're also behind what is effectively economic warfare against China. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's all going to collapse because we're broke.
Yeah, I always thought that a peace would have to be, well, because the Europeans have essentially, the boycotting diplomacy. So I always thought that a peace in Ukraine would have to be established between Moscow and the US. But it's just, there's nothing, there's no losses for the NATO countries though. So there's not that much motivation for ending this. I mean, if if the Ukrainians kill one Russian, the Russian kill 5 Ukrainians, this is zero loss for NATO. So it's not that pressure to put an end to this. I'm just thinking but at the same time, there's no willingness in Kiev under Zelensky either to find some kind of a deal. I know that once the Russians went in 2022, within the first few days, Zelensky had agreed to meet with the Russians to discuss neutrality. He had made his points that we also perhaps need a deal that recognizes Russian security interests, things which would be unthinkable to discuss today. But today, I don't think it's possible for Zelensky to discuss these things. But it only leaves military victory left on the table, it seems, which is very depressing. I don't know. I still think if anyone would have told me 20 years ago that Ukrainians and Russians would be killing each other in the hundreds of thousands, it would be very hard to believe this. But if we take a step back, you mentioned before that Sykes-Picot is over, that will be a new Middle East. How do you look at it in terms of Europe, though? Because as this is over, we see now Russia, it's not over yet, but we will see Russia, China play a very different role. The Europeans and Americans will probably be a bit more fragmented. At least the political West won't look like it did in the past. How do you see essentially the world being shaped by these wars?
I think we and the Europeans are going to have to turn inward and focus on all of the terrible problems that we have created for ourselves inside our own societies. And I know that very few people look at things from that standpoint. Nobody likes to say we are the authors of our own destruction, but we're all going to have to look at the policies of the past 30, 40 years that have brought us to this point in time. The Europeans are going to have to deal with all these vast numbers of unwanted migrants, people that came in starting in 2015 that the Europeans were never asked about. They were never consulted. There was no plebiscite. Now they're stuck. And it gets worse with each passing day. We now have demonstrations in Spain over a recent decision to admit more people that the Spaniards do not want in their country. I think this is going to have to be addressed. And we have a similar problem in the United States. Millions have streamed into our country under Biden and under some of his predecessors, but certainly what happened under Biden was unprecedented. Those things have to be dealt with, and those pose existential questions for us and our societies. What do we want? I mean, somebody talked to me the other day, said, Doug, the problem is we have tried to get Americans to focus on all of these unnecessary wars, interventions overseas for many years by identifying whatever we were doing with human rights and democracy. He said, you and I know that's all nonsense. I said, of course. He said, Americans are beginning to figure it out. They now know that they were essentially deceived, lied to. I think Europeans are going to reach the same conclusion, and I think you'll see something in the West on the scale of the revolutions of 1848. Now, those revolutions did not achieve their aims because at the time the governments were strong and they didn't have to make many compromises, and they could use the armed forces and the police against the people. This time around it's going to be tougher. The governments are not strong, and I think that's another reason why the wars overseas receive so much attention. If they can create the perception of conflict and crisis, that keeps them in power, extends them in power. How long can you live in a country like Germany, which has been a leader in the world in scientific industrial terms and built, in my judgment, a very successful and fabulous society after World War II? You can't expect that to be destroyed and no one to do anything. But there's another aspect, and you sort of pointed to this earlier. Something given has no value. If you don't earn it, you don't appreciate it. The people that rebuilt Europe after World War II in Germany, they understood what they were doing. They appreciated the criticality of the task in front of them, and they were devoted to their country, and they rebuilt it. They've passed. They're gone in overwhelming numbers. The people that are there now are the beneficiaries in many respects of what was done. but they've also become the victims of dumb policies, destructive policies, some of which they voted for and some of which they did not. Now they have to deal with reality, but they didn't build it. They're just living in it. Now they know how important it is, how they must now fight for it if it is to survive. And I think that's true all over Scandinavia. I think it's true everywhere. You know, it's true in the United States. My generation built nothing. It consumed. Well, the consumption is about to end. So the building has to begin. We're going to have to build something new because what we built in the past is no longer applicable to our needs today. That may be true in Europe as well. That's why I think these wars, these conflicts will end for reasons of finance and economics more than anything else. And I'm not demeaning or disparaging the achievements of the Iranians, for God's sakes, who had stood up successfully against enormous military power. Nor am I disparaging the Russian military achievement. I'm simply saying that inside the West, the United States and the West, I think it's going to happen to some extent in Japan and Korea. Korea just shut down its stock market yesterday. That's just the beginning of emergencies that we're going to face in the future. You're going to see bank runs. You're going to see all the things that we've seen in the past and worse. But these things we'll have to deal with internally will suddenly make everything that's happening beyond our borders irrelevant.